Hello, and welcome to the Dissonance Podcast, where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. Hi, welcome back to the Dissonance Podcast. And today, Jen, we have your dog in the background. What's your dog's name?
Yeah, there he is. That's the dude.
The dude?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So today it's Elizabeth and Jen from ILV and Nafees Alam from I don't know where to say. Well, from Nebraska right now, formerly of Boise State and other fun backgrounds. So we asked Nafees to come because I was at FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression conference in Boston, and he did a really cool presentation, which ILV we will be hosting him to actually give a version of that presentation in the not too distant future. And I immediately, I connected with that, but also, I don't know, I just felt this weird kind of connection with him. So on the last night, he was all by himself on a couch, and I just marched over there and sat next to him on the couch and introduced myself. And we had a really great conversation. This is going to sound weird, but Nafees, you're just so like normal. And so it just felt really comfortable. Now we do share, this like, love of working out and all that kind of thing. And not that we could have known that about each other until, we started talking, but, you have just this really eclectic background, which is maybe why it seems you feel normal to me. It feels normal simply because you can talk to anybody, right? So I feel that, you can talk to anybody. You actually have even a more eclectic background than I knew, because I heard your little heterodox talk, which maybe we could link in the show notes. And you mentioned that you went to a Jewish institution to get your PhD, and you have an Islamic last name. So you kind of have, it's like gets your foot in multiple doors. And then a little shout out, with regard to the working out stuff, that, you have some articles on, on fitness and exercise. You certainly have your own fitness journey. And I don't know, I just, it felt really good. And you've been coming, visiting with us at ILV, and we have some things planned. So I'm going to let you say a little bit more about yourself and, what drew you to ILV? I mean, I know it wasn't just my sales pitch, so.
You're very, and Nafees, before, I don't mean to interrupt, my apologies, but I have to tell you that the three of us are all gym rats. So we can at least start with that in common, if nothing else.
Yeah, it's true. And I think, when you say normal, I think of accessible in the sense of, I feel like there's way too many people who maybe have earned the right with the degrees and the salaries that they have to, speak and act in such a way that they're better than other people. And I don't know if that's the way we want to, go with higher education, society, and culture. So I take a lot of pride in being normal. It's funny because we haven't talked about this before, but being normal is very important because, I've written articles about how we get into our silos, our echo chambers, thinking that we're better, the ivory tower, thinking that the ivory tower is better than Main Street or better than Wall Street. It's important to understand that, with the degrees that we have and the positions and the status that we have comes with a certain responsibility to the masses, to the normal people. And it's important for us to be as accessible as possible in that sense. And yeah, we do share a love of fitness, and sports. And I think that also keeps people on track. I think physical fitness is very closely connected with mental health and emotional health. And also intellectual health, which is a newer concept that's coming into play. Intellectual health, as in like, how productive are you in the classroom, and writing articles, if you're into that kind of stuff. And whenever you hit writer's block, how do you get through it? Well, same way you do at the gym. You try and go for a PR, you fail today, You sort of figure out what exactly happened. Maybe if we're talking like a bench press, maybe it was the angle that you were attacking it at, and you sort of figure, okay, I got to switch up the arm angle. When you go back and sit in front of the computer, maybe I just have to switch up the perspective angle that I'm using to study this topic. And I found that to be really valuable. So that the lessons that I learned playing football, being at the gym, carries over into the academic arena as a professor and as someone who writes as well.
I think, Elizabeth, I would use the word not necessarily normal, although, whatever, but authentic. Authentic is the word that I would use. So you came on, kind of unknown to me, first meeting, and it just felt like sitting down with a friend. Mm-hmm. So if that's normal, normal's good then. But so I'm learning more about you every day, and it's very fascinating. Your background, like Elizabeth said, that you went to a Jewish school. You've got an Islamic last name. You're in social work now. I would just love, like, if you can start wherever you think the beginning is. If you can start from the beginning, I always call it your origin story, and kind of get us up to where we are today.
Sure. Yeah. And, again, the idea of just being kindred spirits in this regard, I feel like I really connected with Elizabeth, and I'm connecting with you, Jennifer, the more we get to know each other. And, I'm looking forward to a long, professional relationship and growing together in this sphere. As far as my origin story, it's, I was at the City University of New York, Hunter College, back, I think, in 2010. It was the first project that I had to for my master's education, my MSW. And I was asked to write a reflection piece on white privilege, unpacking the invisible knapsack. And it was a personal reflection piece. That's what it was supposed to be. So I dissected it. And for listeners who don't know, it's just, a fairly short article. Has about, I believe, 26 points of white privilege. And my reflection in that paper was that, well, most of this isn't white privilege, it's green privilege, socioeconomic status. So having some money and sort of coming from a background of wealth, I feel like, that provides many of the privileges that are explained away as white privilege there. So that was my response. That was my reflection paper. And I thought I did a good job of it. I got the worst grade that I've ever gotten in my academic career. And so it was a failing grade. And the comments weren't anything more than at the end saying you missed the spirit of the assignment. I was allowed to redo the assignment, which I did. But as a social scientist / prankster that I am at heart, I submitted the same exact piece, same number of sentences, same references, same everything, same spelling, same grammar, except every position I held in the first paper, I held the opposite position in the second paper. This was back in the day when they would want to hang, papers up on bulletin boards using thumbtacks, and that's what happened. I went from a failing grade to a perfect grade. Professors wanting to hang my paper up. I changed nothing except the perspective. So that was the moment when, prior to that, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. There was football, there was finance, there was a whole bunch of other things. That was the moment where I realized at some point in my career, I want to get a PhD. I want to be a professor. I want to be in front of the students. I want to produce work that shows that it is okay to think differently. Because at that point, I wasn't graded for my ability to think for myself. I was graded on my ability to adhere to a certain orthodoxy. And so with the intent to change that perspective and change that narrative, throughout my master's and the early part of my doctorate, I pretended to be something that I'm not in my writing to get the best grades possible. And then, as my old coach used to say, you gotta learn to play the game before you change the game. I've played the game for many years, got my doctorate, and now it's my opportunity to change the game. I have 4 decades of career to do it.
Oh, I did not know that background. The what is it? Unpacking the invisible knapsack, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and so what this unpacking the invisible knapsack? If you said this, I missed it. What year around about was this when you were working on that?
I believe it was 2010. I have to look back on my.
It's kind of a famous article, if you will.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The article originally was from the 70s, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. But that's what led me, as you mentioned earlier, to really embrace this point counterpoint perspective. And I wanted to go to Yeshiva University, a Jewish institution with an Islamic last name, and just see put myself in a place where I would theoretically be unwelcome. I felt really welcome there. In fact, that was the first university where I actually taught as well. So I was welcome with open arms despite my last name, and I found, I wouldn't say love because that's more of a professional environment, but acceptance, an acknowledgement of what I bring to the table intellectually, even if I'm not a practicing Muslim, but that question never even came up. But if people were to assume that I'm a practicing Muslim, still for me to be welcome in every space at Yeshiva University, I felt a sense of just understanding, even if people might have different religious views than I do. So I've tried to embrace it as much as I can, put myself in places where I'm not welcome theoretically. I don't want to be in places where I'm physically unwelcome and getting jumped or beat up, but getting an opportunity to learn from different perspectives and also hopefully contribute to those conversations. I really cherish that.
I think that coincides with. I did want to ask you about your safe spaces and brave spaces, and I think that it sort of segues into that. Because I rewatched that little segment again today, and you were actually supporting safe spaces, but calling them brave spaces. So could you share with us?
Yeah, so safe spaces have a recent history of being thought of as spaces where no one is allowed to say anything. And so the safest conversation we can have is this: silence. Because even if I were to ask you your gender, your race, your name, even there's a potential to offend someone. So if we truly want a safe space, we would be sitting in silence, the three of us, and the listeners as well. We would all be sitting in silence, and listeners would be listening to silence, thinking that this something's wrong, and Wi-Fi must not be working. So I try to sort of infuse the concept of brave spaces, which have been written about quite extensively as of late, as a place where it's not so much about emotional safety, rather about intellectual exploration. And in order to be as intellectual as possible, you have to be willing to get offended, and you have to be willing to offend others. There are questions. I'll use myself as an example because I don't want to get canceled. So you might look at me and ask. You probably wouldn't ask explicitly, but you might be wondering. I wonder if he likes, with that name, with his skin color. I wonder if he likes curry. And the answer is yes. I love curry. My mom. My mom is excellent at cooking. I grew up with it, and I will love it until the day that I die. But why are we not allowed to ask these questions? Now, I don't take offense to questions like these. In fact, I would take even more offense to you intentionally not asking a question that's on your mind. So I think the concept of safe spaces have gotten corrupted in that sense, where it has to be silence. No one must be offended in this conversation. Well, you're going to end up having no conversation at all. A brave space calls for people to say, I'm going to ask these questions in good faith. And that good faith baseline is where that brave space comes from. Now, certainly people can ask me questions and you can pick up on the bad faith element there. That's a different story. But if people are actually intellectually curious, they shouldn't be afraid to ask difficult questions to get to those answers.
You just said something. Yes, so Wink, my co-author that Elizabeth knows quite well, we talk about this a lot in our book, and just even in general. It's become taboo to ask, "Where are you from?" And Wink loves that question. Like he I mean, he wants, and it doesn't matter if you are brown or white. I mean, whether you're from New York or from India. Like where are you from? Like tell, and that's like that just gives so much insight to who you are. And so, Nafees, I mean, I want to know more about. You said you like curry. Where does your family? Where do they hail from?
Yeah.
Tell us more about that.
Sure. So I was born in Libya while my father was an English professor there, but my heritage is from Bangladesh, a little country near India and Pakistan. So I grew up with what most people would consider Indian food, although we tend to have a lot more beef than Indian people do. And yeah, it's my mom is a practicing Muslim. My father recently has become practicing Muslim as well. My brother and I are both agnostic, much to the chagrin of my mom, especially. But even within our family, and I know you didn't ask this question, but I'll just quickly mention it anyway. Even within our family, the Alam family, the four of us think so differently from one another that point counterpoint, intellectual ideological diversity perspective is what we woke up to and went to sleep to. My brother and I, despite being agnostic, we differ in many ways politically. So we had some heated conversations at the dinner table, which now seem to be, national and international conversations as well.
So Libya your father was a professor of English in Libya, is that, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. What an interesting background. And so what made your family immigrate to the United States?
Yeah, so when I was born, we moved back to Bangladesh, and my mom was a visa recipient to the United States, and that's what brought me here back in 1991, I believe, when I was 7 years old, and we've been here since.
So Jennifer's been all over the world too. I have never been anywhere. So
you travel in the mind, Elizabeth.
Yeah. I mean, you go to Boston. You've been there, so traveling locally is fun too.
Yeah, but I can see Boston from my window.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what. Traveling to Boston a couple months ago was one of the more harrowing travels I've done.
And you've been all over the world, and Boston is yes, it is quite harrowing. I agree.
I was traveling right through the town. Yep.
Yes. Okay. It is terrifying, that's for sure.
Yeah, it can be really busy.
So, Nafees, I'm sorry, Elizabeth, were you going to ask?
Well, I was just going to ask you. You've mentioned point counterpoint several times, and so I do want to hear just a little bit about that style. And people can find you're on video a couple of places talking about that too. But you use this formally in the classroom. I mean, you're using it informally here in our talk here. But can you describe what you did in the classroom and how that worked?
So the point counterpoint teaching philosophy, which is my teaching philosophy, is the baseline understanding that you don't understand your point of view until you understand the credibility and validity of opposing and conflicting points of view. So if we tend to believe that our point of view it should be what everybody else believes, and there's no reason why other people should think differently, we don't even understand our own viewpoint, much less other people's viewpoints. So with that baseline in mind, what I do practically in the classroom is I'll have vlog assignments. I call them point counterpoint vlogs. It's only 1 minute, and you're recording yourself with your phone on video. Let's say we're talking about a topic like abortion or gun rights. For 30 seconds, well, really about 25 seconds, I want to hear you be pro one side, pause a little bit, and then I want to hear you be con the other side. And you get a higher grade if I don't know where you stand. Because the idea around that is that you should be able to represent opposing viewpoints in such a way that it is convincing in an academic sense. Not because I want you to change who you are, but because I want you to be more of whoever it is that you are. It's kind of like a salmon being a stronger fish swimming upstream. You don't get weaker by considering the credibility and validity of opposing viewpoints. You get stronger.
Okay, that's really fascinating, but I would find that I think even teachers in the classroom, almost immediately where they stand on any like political, there's no hiding that anymore. And so for you to actually teach that to our kids, where they would, enter into life, let alone maybe even enter into academia with that viewpoint or that point counterpoint viewpoint is brilliant. And I don't see it being done that much. I mean, in your experience, is that novel? Do you see other teachers doing that, or do you see that what you're doing pretty much on your own? Or
I hesitate to call it novel because it's one of those things where it's like as soon as I say it, someone's gonna show up and on tape like 2010, 2000. I I studied it thoroughly because I have to put forth a formal teaching philosophy, and I could not find records of this style of actual class activities taking place. Now there is a Socratic method of making sure that you cover differing viewpoints, but the practical application of it, I don't know if others are doing it. At the same time, I wouldn't call this idea novel. I think it's, in fact, I would call it a throwback. I
Mm.
think it's more of a traditionalist educational approach in that I'm just going back to how education began. And, like, this is an academic, intellectual space. We can have emotions here, but our priority is intellectual exploration, not emotional safety. So, if anything, I would think it would be the opposite of novel.
Yeah,
And you
it's
can't,
perfect.
obviously you can't use it in all classes on all subjects, and but just the other day, so I was teaching about I teach cognitive psychology, and I was teaching about language. And there's a school of thought that that language influences our perception, our attention, our memory, everything. And then others say no, there's rich intellectual thought and growth and everything without language, right? That we don't need language. And so they were offering sort of their, it's like one said, oh well, I work with autistic kids who don't have language, and they're clear, there's clearly like they're pretty darn smart, and so it's just sort of a version of that, but they really do want you to come down on a side, so that's not political, but that's like, oh well, tell me the right answer. And it was funny because it was like you had a plant in the audience, when you have somebody, actually this always happens because as teachers you kind of get to know the rhythm, and so somebody finally just pushes me and says, yeah, but which is right, and I actually had a slide that was just a chicken and an egg. And I was like, funny you ask, because cognitive psychologists can't decide, but people are very unsatisfied with that.
Mm.
um, Students especially, but I think that we are also, as we move through our lives, very unsatisfied with that. And not to make this all about me, but I had a I'm kind of in a funk today, in part because I had this exact experience where I was at the gym. My gym is fairly conservative. I've been was I lean more left, but was quite harmed by the left. So I was, um, and the what I was experiencing, I was trying to explain to this guy. It's like, you're telling me, you're on, more on the right. You're telling me if I come over to your side, I will be saved, right? So if I just, if the new administration will save me, that coming over to that side will save me. And but I was trying to explain, well, like the people on the left, the people that are telling me, if only you come over to our side fully, you will be saved. And I feel like, you remember that old saying, which maybe you don't, Nafees, but you might, Jen, that the cafeteria Catholic,
Mm-mm.
where they say, oh well, you don't get to pick and choose. If you go to Catholic church, you have to buy the doctor, the whole thing. Okay, you can't be a cafeteria Catholic. And I'm like, well, I want to be a cafeteria thinker, right? Like there are aspects of you know of ideology on both sides that I can agree with and understand and feel are useful, important, whatever. And I do feel the same thing, just moving, navigating through our life. I feel the same pull. Well, who are you? Which side are you on? Who are I need to know who you are. I need to know the right answer about you before I can interact with you any further. I don't know. Like, am I alone in this feeling? Does this resonate at all with either of you two?
Yeah, it certainly does. I think it's one of those things where there's such a push to find an answer that we don't appreciate the questions. I talk about this, and this is probably not the best analogy, but I like to use it in class anyway, because I don't want people doing this in their own, romantic relationships. But I say you should be marrying the questions and dating the answers. Obviously in real life, if you're married, you probably shouldn't be dating anyone, but you get the idea is that the answers might change, but the questions remain. And depending on whether it's 2024 or 2034 or 3024, those answers, whatever questions you have, they will change. And back in 1724, the answers were different, but many of the questions were still the same. So if we can marry the questions and date the answers and not be so stuck on, well, what is the right answer? Well, maybe the better question is, what is the right question? What is a question that we can ask that will have a different answer as time moves forward? Because that is a really beautiful part of of our human existence. And also to the effect of answers and just the left has an answer for the right and the right answer has an answer for the left. If you think of a pendulum, it moves fastest when it's in the middle. The push and pull factors are the fastest and most profound when it's in the middle. So the answer to what many might see as a liberal indoctrination is not a conservative indoctrination, and that's what I fear. Is that is the backlash of a perception of leftward indoctrination in higher education, will that give way to a rightward indoctrination in higher education? Two wrongs will never make a right. So I think it's the responsibility of educators and professors, instructors, to try their best to stay in the middle, which usually means just talking about the right questions and not what the right answers may be for them or anybody else. That's really difficult because we're not just professors, we're also people. And in our personal lives, I'm very strong in my opinions on politics and ethics and all that. And I'm sure all of us are. I'm sure listeners are as well. But in that professional setting where we're trying to foster critical thinking, we have to also keep ourselves in check. So this way we don't, introduce our indoctrination in response to what we perceive as indoctrination.
So, you having said all that, it's no wonder that you lean towards social work. But can you tell us a little bit more about what drew you in to social work? I mean, that is your degree, that is your your passion. How did that begin?
Well, as an athlete, things didn't work out for me. So I struggled with my mental health when sports didn't work out. And my father is a social work professor as well, so he helped me a lot. And I met with a lot of different people, and just helping me figure out the next path of what I would be doing. And I wanted to give back. And I'm fortunate enough to work specifically in sports social work. That's my research agenda, helping athletes, whether it's because of injury or just they don't have it anymore, working into retirement. If it's a collegiate athlete who had the promise of making $20 million a year, suffers an injury, now they're going to be making $20,000 a year. That's a huge, dream to give up on. So, just helping people navigate there. Secondarily, it sort of came into that, social work and viewpoint diversity are starting to be acknowledged in that arena. So originally my plan was to be a sports social worker, have the practice life of just doing sports social work, but also have that my personal passion of applying viewpoint diversity in higher education. And now with DEI and ADEI, it's an opportunity for us social workers, mental health professionals to work toward the acknowledgement of viewpoint diversity as part of the diversity, equity, and inclusion matrix.
Fingers crossed.
Yes.
Well, Elizabeth, you've been dealing with this question a lot in our social work series on viewpoint diversity and social work and the code of ethics. I mean, what is that viewpoint diversity? Are we seeing it?
Well, right. So that's the thing, right? And this is one of the discussions I was having today with someone was, I think that, this person said to me, well, did your left-wing professors learn their lesson? So after the election, right? And I was like, no, this is like, if that's what you thought you were doing, that's not the message that they got, right? They got this whole other message. And one of the things that I was talking about, and Jen, you wouldn't know a lot about this because you're not in the academic world, but schools have to get accredited, obviously, and they go through this process every 5 to 10 years, and they have to provide evidence that they met the last goals, but they also have to provide a set of goals for the next 10 years. Okay, so 2 years ago, for example, say a school is in that cycle, okay, in the last 3 to 5 years, right? They're in that cycle. So what do you think their 10-year plan was? It was focused on DEI. It was focused on social justice. It was focused on critical social justice. That's what's in their 10-year plan. Okay. So for example, at my school, racial and that kind of thing showed up in the single digits in the 20 years ago in the 10-year plan. Okay. It was more in describing demographics. In the next 10-year plan, and the one that was just a year or two ago, it shows up hundreds of times. So some combination of race, racial justice, social justice, those combinations show up hundreds of times. So you can't vote in a new administration who says off with their heads, and the accreditation plan just gets thrown out the window. No, you are held accountable when the accreditation firm comes back in and looks at your school and what you've done. It is comparing it to what you said you were going to do. So there's no just throwing this plan out, because you won't meet the accreditation goals. So if you said you were going to put in, which my school did, a social justice thing in the core, like now it's not just multicultural or whatever, but it has to be social justice, then you have to implement that. And every person who gets a degree must take those courses. That's part of your liberal arts education. And they're not going to throw that out because a new person got elected. And so nothing is going to change. I mean, it's like, if that's why you thought you did it, it's not going to work. And so yeah, I mean, we're seeing, and I was surprised at how not just how left leaning, how progressive social work was, but how, at least in a couple of instances, we found how sure they are that it must remain that way, and even suggested that they cut people, that they be gatekeepers, and if you're not progressive enough, you maybe shouldn't get your degree in social work. So I'm not seeing that in some of the stuff that we've covered. I don't know. I mean, what did you see when you were teaching?
Yeah,
Nafees, because you were actually teaching in a school of social work, right? And I mean, I know you had this freedom of thought class, but you had other social work more I mean, did you see, or what did you see when you were teaching? What did you feel about your what you could teach or should be teaching or whatever?
Well, the perception in general across the nation is that intellectual ideological diversity is not one of the categories of diversity, which I joke around and say, well, that's a very non-diverse way of defining diversity. But that it indicates somewhat of an agenda. At the same time, I like to give people the benefit of the doubt, and I really try to understand why that is the case. And the responses that I've heard is that, well, we need to prioritize racial diversity, gender diversity, sexual diversity before we prioritize the diversity of thought. Which my response is, why is it a zero-sum game? Why can't we prioritize all diversity? I also think there's an element of maybe subconscious racism and sexism and all the isms when someone were to say, well, this is how brown people think, and this is how black people think, and this is how white people think. That sounds anti-racist, yet that is textbook racism. right? So I'm working on an article. I mentioned this in a previous meeting, titled "Anti-Racist Perplexed by the Diversity of Black and Brown Thought," because believe it or not, Black and Brown people don't all think alike.
Huh.
Oh yeah, you know. So I've switched from the concept of can we also include viewpoint diversity in the categories of DEI in that DEI matrix into the concept of viewpoint diversity is racial diversity. Viewpoint diversity is gender diversity, is sexual orientation diversity. Viewpoint diversity is a part of every type of diversity, and some might say that it needs to be talked about first. And you know who would definitely say it? Talk about not being novel. A long time ago, someone once said, I dream of the day that children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. The content of our character is the element of diversity that seems to be ignored in 2024 and 2025. It seems to be the color of skin has taken precedence. Martin Luther King would be very upset with where we are today.
That reminds me something not the same but similar that our friend Eric Smith says. He says that classical liberalism is social justice. And I think that's kind of very similar to viewpoint diversity is the bedrock of diversity. And again, we're kind of missing that element in the way we talk about these issues today.
We are, and hopefully we, the three of us, and then we're a larger group, and creating a movement sort of thing where we're encouraging people to come out of hiding and speak up. And I think we're already seeing some changes happening. Some students that are publishing some of their work. One student, I don't have their permission to share their work yet, but that will be published very soon. It was of a former social work PhD student, and that's going to be a very meaningful article of just the lack of viewpoint diversity in higher education. My field is social work, but I know that this is consistent with other fields as well. And I think this is an opportunity for us to gather together and strive toward viewpoint diversity. And of course, making sure to keep ourselves in check, because again, it's one of those things where, if we end up gaining too much power, there's an option and a possibility that we apply the same level of indoctrinated thought that we are trying to combat. So yeah.
I agree. I am noticing like after class, before class, in the hallway, I am noticing more students kind of, saying something that maybe like testing the waters a little bit, not so much in class, because they're afraid of each other. I don't think that they're afraid of the teachers so much. But I do think they're a little bit afraid of each other, that, somebody's going to take offense, they're going to hurt someone's feelings or whatever. But I am noticing, and I did a directed study with a student last semester who wouldn't present her research, but she did do a comparison of McCarthy era self-censorship and self-censorship today. And that was her choice of the topic that she wanted to do. And I don't know that a few years ago, a student even would have said that they wanted to study that, but she wouldn't present it. She was afraid to present it on campus. But yeah, I mean, it's, I am noticing, I think, a little bit of change. We'll see. I mean, one of the things that when I rewatched the heterodox talk, the other speaker that you were talking with, I can't remember his name right now, but he said, campuses used to be places where we just hung out and laughed. And I was like, oh, wow, that is what we did. We did a lot of hanging out and laughing, and we made fools of ourselves and of each other, and just like made silly mistakes, and maybe hurt each other's feelings. But that was part of what we figured out, right? Was how we lived in dorms, dorm hallways with each other, and we had to figure out how to get along. And I do think that's something that we're missing, and that's part of viewpoint diversity. Learning that, it's like, I can't believe she's dating that knucklehead, but if I want to be friends with her, I got to figure out how to be friends with the knucklehead too.
Yeah, and Dylan Seltzer is the gentleman's name. He's a friend of
Yeah.
mine, and yeah, it's it's the concept of safe spaces today. The way that it's defined prohibits us from having a lot of fun, and prohibits us from being knuckleheads. But that's how we learn. None of us are born, smart and savvy. We make our mistakes, and then we learn who not to be, in addition to who we want to be. Now, a safe space doesn't really allow for us to be as explorative as we can be. So when do we get to learn more about ourselves and more about society? I don't know if there are options for that or avenues for that anymore. So, you know, he made some excellent points, and again, he is a friend of mine, and his points were well taken in that if we were to apply the social definition of what safe spaces are in 2024, it is prohibitive toward education, not just higher education, education in general, because indeed the safest conversation we would have is silence. But if we approach it in the sense of brave spaces, where we acknowledge that some conversations can be very hurtful. I talked about Nazi research studies while teaching at a Jewish university, as a brand new adjunct professor. So yeah, I certainly people felt offended, but I led with that. I told them that this is part of the curriculum. Number one, I'm also going to approach it from an intellectual sense. If there are some emotional, topics that you want to talk about based on what you know about your great grandparents, feel free to chime in there because that's what gives life to these topics. Yes, it's partly intellectual, but it's also emotional. We cannot be afraid or fearful of going into any of these spaces because if we do, then we just remain silent.
You know what I think is missing? Listening to us talk about viewpoint diversity, which obviously we're saying is clearly lacking in many regards. The other thing that I think is missing, and I don't know if we ever really had it, but I feel like we had it at least in more abundance, is grace. I mean, you said something earlier about don't be married to the answers. I mean, we change our minds every day. I am not the same person as I was even when I woke up, or I'm not the same person to you and Elizabeth as I am to my cousin and my aunt, right? I mean, and so that that grace is incredibly important to me, and I think that that allows for forgiveness, it allows for understanding, it allows for empathy, and all those things, because of the lack of viewpoint diversity, have been like just taken off the shelf. And
Yeah.
that's why we have these safe spaces, because there's no grace. And so you might as well, we make, like I said, Elizabeth, knuckleheads. I mean, we make mistakes all the time. We do dumbass shit. Sorry, I don't usually cuss on podcast, but and there's just no that's just lacking. And I wonder, Nafees, if I would love to get your feedback. Is it something that you saw that we used to have? Is it something that just its dearth has become more apparent? What are your thoughts around that? Because I feel like grace and empathy is something that is very much intertwined with social work.
Well, I think grace is achieved through experiences of not being graceful and learning from those experiences. You know, but we're living in an environment in some cases where we don't get to make those ungraceful mistakes to learn how to be graceful. And we also don't get an opportunity to be not empathetic in order to then learn what empathy is and how we want to apply it. So in many ways, education is taking opportunities away for education, which sounds like a weird thing to say. But if we're saying, well, we have to have safe spaces, everyone must be empathetic to everybody else, and we don't offend anybody else, well, we don't get an opportunity to be ungraceful to learn how to be graceful. We don't get an opportunity to be not empathetic in order to then learn what empathy is and how to be empathetic. So really taking away lessons from people. And we think we're doing a good job because we're saying, well, you don't have to do it yourself. I'm telling you what it is. Well, experiential knowledge has long been studied to be the best teacher.
Yeah.
And we're taking that away from students. And what that means now is that, 20-year-olds are not getting that experience. But I fear for when those 20-year-olds turn into 40-year-olds and 60-year-olds, how are they going to operate in a world without grace, as you mentioned, without their own ability to have empathy, without someone else telling them to. We're taking these opportunities to learn away from people, and this is going to potentially have dire consequences in the future.
Well, one of the things that I teach and study is sort of, these cultural and family narratives. What are those going to look like when people's experiences are so empty, right? Their stories are so pared down to just, these are the rules, as opposed to these stories of, tripping and falling and screwing up and losing friendship, hurting people and having people hurt you and figuring out how to recover from that. And, all these, this, that's we are living the story. That's how we know who we are. We are our story, right? And that's the way that we get to know other people, is to know their story. Knowing, we can know their personality traits. We can give you a personality test. It's like, oh, here's your personality traits, right? We could even ask you, what are your goals in life, right? But when we know someone, we know their story. And if we're just telling people, here's who you are and here's your goal, and they don't learn to live their story, then what are they going, when they're 40, if they have kids, what are they going to tell? How are they going to tell their kids where they came from and why that matters? Why? I mean, no wonder they feel disconnected, because they're not living their own story.
Yeah.
Well, because that's authenticity, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And no, you're fine. And the concept of authenticity is that you don't know who you are. I'm still learning who I am, and to my dying day, I'll be a dynamic subject, hopefully, and never static. And same thing with the three of us, and to our listeners as well. For our listeners, think about how different you were 5 years ago versus 10 years ago. That's how different you'll be 5 years from now and 10 years from now. And the way we change and the way we adapt and the way we evolve is by making those mistakes. We're living in a society, in some ways, some would suggest, that we are learning how not to make mistakes in order to not have to learn how to say sorry
Right.
for those mistakes. And while that sounds great because it sounds like a utopia, everyone is nice to each other, but that doesn't that's not because we actually want to be nice to each other. We have not gotten to learn what is nice and what is not, what is kind and what is not. We're just being told, prescribed certain behaviors. And then, as Elizabeth, you've mentioned, in that when we're old enough and we have children and we're trying to teach our children these lessons, what lessons would we have if we haven't made any mistakes? I talk about in sports, I try to change the concept of wins and losses into wins and lessons, generally because I suck at coaching and my teams usually lose. So that's why I have to call them lessons instead of losses, because all we do is lose. But the idea is that you learn more through your mistakes than through your successes, because when you're successful, you feel like you know it all or know what's necessary. When you're unsuccessful, when you lose, that's when the real lessons come up, because now you have to change in some way. And that desire to change is where that mistake turns into perhaps the best thing that could have happened to you.
And even great joy sometimes has this aspect of sadness, right?
Yes.
And
I like call it joy. You and I talked about this.
yeah.
Yeah.
What is nostalgia but joy combined with sadness, right? And I see a flatness, a zombie-like quality to young people in my classroom. Not only is there, there just doesn't seem to be much emotion at all. There seems to just be this sort of flatness about life. So I really don't want to leave without talking about toxic masculinity.
Oh, I didn't know you were going to go there. Okay.
Well, there, well, yeah. So this, well, I mean, I do think it's related. It's identity related, right? Like, where do we learn what masculinity is, and what are we learning, and we're in a bad way in terms of of masculinity and you've talked about this before, you've written about it, so I don't want to leave without talking about that.
Yeah, sure. So I've written an article called Toxic by Default Masculinity. And the concept there is that what used to be traditional masculinity in many ways is considered toxic masculinity today. And any indication of masculine behaviors uh, are met at the start with negativity. Before it's sort of like a guilty until proven innocent perspective, as opposed to an innocent until proven guilty. And many traditionally masculine behaviors are today seen as toxic. For example, stoicism, competitiveness, aggression, but in a controlled setting like boxing, for example. These are considered toxic. And in my article, I encourage you to read it, but if you don't, I'm just going to tell you how it ends. I talk about how like toxic masculinity becomes necessary masculinity when we have no other choice. When we've experienced peaceful times for a very long time now, but human history would suggest that we are well overdue for some sort of conflict that involves physical intervention like a war. And during war times, those who are aggressive, those toxic masculine traits will be coveted, and we don't want that to happen. This isn't something where it's like, oh, I really hope World War III happens so this way I can prove myself right. I hope that we never have to prove these theories right. But my theories are that what is considered toxic today, toxic masculinity today, will be necessary masculinity one day in the future, which is inevitable, history would tell us, when those aggressive, those competitive, those brash men are seen as the heroes. Go fight a war so this way I don't have to. Go be competitive. Go kill people. So that this way we are not killed ourselves and we don't have to do the killing. Now, in peaceful times, it's easy to look at the warrior and say he doesn't belong. In peaceful times, the gardener is seen as the party that is most coveted. But as soon as there is some conflict, gardeners often cannot double as warriors, whereas warriors can sometimes double as gardeners. So it's important to understand that what we consider to be toxic masculinity today speaks to the level of privilege we have. Because I can tell you, toxic masculinity is a very different idea in Ukraine, in Russia right now, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, which is where my parents and I are from, in Libya, which is where I was born. Toxic masculinity is very different there. So whenever we talk about traditional elements of masculinity as being toxic masculinity, we have to acknowledge the privileged position that we're speaking about it from. At the same time, there are counterpoints here. There's also a history of male to female domestic violence that is long documented. That indeed is toxic masculinity, and that is a history of toxic masculinity. There's an even longer recorded history of financial dominance of women. Of men over women. That is clear toxic masculinity as well. I think we need to practice a greater deal of responsibility and maturity in understanding that the concept of toxic masculinity is a lot more sophisticated, and not everything is simply toxic or not toxic.
It's kind of on a matrix.
Exactly.
Stay tuned for Nafees's Matrix talk.
Yeah. It'll be fun. I can't wait.
I'll put your articles in our show notes too, so that, because I hadn't read the piece on toxic masculinity, so that's why, Elizabeth, you took me off. Yeah. Where did that come from?
Well, it is identity related. It's like how do we tell our stories, right, about who we are and where we came from, and I do think that we have a bit of a crisis of masculinity, and young men aren't sure. I mean, none of us are sure when we're young, but are even less, less sure. And I see, we keep going back to the gym, but, I see in the gym, like essentially now half naked women, right? And no one, it's like they're afraid that they're actually being filmed, potentially being filmed. It's like, then, it's like, you looking at me? How dare you look at me? Well, I mean, you're pretty attractive, and but this is not allowed. I don't see the young men and the young women in the gym talking to each other.
Well,
I don't see, everybody's got their ear things in, and everybody's averting their eyes. We're not, we're not hanging out and having and laughing together in the gym or on campuses.
I'll tell you that I've had the wonderful opportunity still to speak with a lot of young men. They'll reach out to me sometimes through social media. We'll set up coaching calls and things like that. And based on the articles I've written that have been making the rounds, I'm fortunate in being able to speak with these young men. And many of the questions are that, like, well, I like this girl. I don't know what to do. And I don't want to be canceled. I don't want to be in an awkward position where I have this weird reputation. And, I want to be responsible, and I want to give them the best possible advice. So I tell them, maybe don't ask a girl out to the prom. Maybe don't ask a girl out on a date. Don't look, in her direction at the gym. Because right now, there's so much incentive to put you on blast and put you up on TikTok and get 1 million views. And look at this guy who glanced at me for it seems like 10 seconds, but only because you slowed the video down.
Right.
There's so many, so in that sense, going back to the drawing board and trying to figure out what to tell these young men, I've gotten to the point where I tell them, take my advice or leave it. Don't live based on what I'm telling you. But since you're asking me, I will put myself in your shoes, and this is what I would do. I would not ask a girl out that I find attractive. I wouldn't look her way. I wouldn't start a conversation. The most that I would do is put myself in a situation where I can be seen by the girl that I like. And then if she comes and speaks with me, then maybe I'll open up conversation there. But even that comes with some risk. So right now I tell you, I know, yeah. Right now I tell young boys and young men, just stay on the sidelines, work on your education, work on your success, work on your money, work on fitness, all that stuff. And as society changes, then you can make a move. Maybe it'll be more appropriate for women to approach men from now on. Which I think that would be my hypothesis. That's the direction that it's going, because young men are just checking out. They're opting for video games and pornography. You can cut the pornography part out if I don't know what level, if this is supposed to be PG.
This is where the dissidents where
Yeah.
But Nafees, if I can interrupt you for a second, I'm listening to all this and my heart just breaks because I'm a boy mom and trying to help my son navigate being a gentleman and doing that, and showing chivalry, which I think, I don't want to be dead. And yet also, treating women well, treating them with equally. And there have been, I won't get into these stories, because they're personal, but I've had to go to bat, with some young girls, and it shocks me. I mean, it shocks me. And so, yeah, I basically am at the same. I'm like, just stay away from women. And that's that's not what you should be saying. But I don't know what else to say.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, you want everyone to stay safe.
Lovely, you're a chauvinist. If you are lovely, you're trying to like get in their pants. I don't know. I mean, it's just there's no winning.
Yeah. So the only way to win is to not play, which is the saddest thing you can say. But this also, on a macro sense, this will have a profound impact for, hundreds of years. Because as men check out, and men have historically been the ones who do the courting, they're going to be marriages on the decline. The divorce rate is through the roof. Although the divorce rate is getting better because fewer people are getting married, so it's sort of like a weird statistic in that sense. Yeah. And then what really stands out is that the birth rates are declining in every civilization that would qualify as Western civilization. What does this mean for us in the next 200 years? It means that there are going to be much fewer humans. And that sounds great to those who are in the camp of like, well, we are overpopulated anyway, we need fewer people. But for others, it's the concept that we may be extincting ourselves through these prohibitions. Now, yeah, you can't go up and just say whatever you want to a woman. But I wonder if this comes back around where now women, I think in the next 2 to 4 years, it will be officially the responsibility of women to court men. What if men now get to the point of taping these interactions and saying, well, you better do better, do better? What ends up happening is that men and women will be turned off from one another. And now, then, this is another time. I've written 5 articles on artificial intelligence in 2024 alone, and a few of them related to dating, in that we are very close to developing synthetic humans. And a little bit of self-disclosure, I've talked to my girlfriend about this, and that if she and I don't work out, I'm not going to date a human again. I will go synthetic. So hopefully she and I stay together for at least the next 5 or 10 years until they figure out that technology out. But that's an old man talking, right?
Like, I just don't want to do this again. It's like, I don't want to, yeah.
Yeah, and imagine younger men who are already turned off to dating. They're going to be in prime dating age in 5 to 10 years, and there might be women that want to be with them, and they might be of the opinion, well, you really cannot compete with a robot. And we're already seeing that come to fruition. So I wonder what this means for humanity as a species long term.
Okay, can we end on something positive? Yeah. Let me look at my notes. Oh, I know. I was going to ask you. So I kept finding the words macro practice. I don't know what macro practice is.
Sure. So macro practice is the application of social work to a non-clinical setting. So if you think organizations, if you think communities, and if you think policies, that's a macro conversation, whereas a clinical conversation would be speaking to you on an individual level, or even doing couples therapy, family therapy. So, for example, what we just talked about, the dating thing, and not to take it back into the sad place, a micro or clinical perspective would be Jennifer speaking to her son, whereas when we discuss what this means for society as a whole in 200, 300 years, that's a macro perspective. And a part of the job of a macro social worker, macro practitioner, is to connect the larger picture with the individual examples. So that's my specialty.
So yeah, so there might be more positive things that we can do on a micro level, even within that macro. So it's sort of understanding the macro level can help us on the micro level, on just in our everyday lives. So we might not be able to change the world, but maybe we can change our our little piece of it. The way that we're coping, or approaching or not approaching people. Making ourselves sort of seen but not seen in the gym or whatever. So yeah, I was not familiar with that at all, but I like that idea of feeling like maybe on a micro level you can coexist in the macro and still make progress, I guess.
Yeah, and I think we can. I think there's hope. I like to take an optimistic approach to everything, and I think there's hope for us yet. I just think we need to have these discussions and figure out what is and what is not, and move forward, and also look to history. Like, human beings have been around for many, many centuries. And, all of a sudden we're running into these issues that haven't existed before. We have to ask ourselves how much of what we're experiencing today is invented and how much of it is actually real. And I think we're going to have these practical common sense conversations, so this way we can get to the bottom of them.
Yeah, unfortunately, we have, there's a difference between, fear and anxiety, right? Fear is, there's an actual danger, and then anxiety is something that, it's like, well, so fear is like that big fish is going to eat me. I'm a little goldfish, and the big fish is going to eat me. But anxiety is, worrying about where the big fish might be, right? And that's yeah. So I think we have the luxury, again, this is privilege, right? We have the privilege of, spending a lot of our, our mental faculties on anxiety, right? Because we don't have to forage for food, and we don't have to worry about whether we have, most of us, whether we have shelter and stuff. And that, yeah, and you actually talked about that too, the sort of safety thing. And if we don't have our basic needs met, then we're not going to be able to, do those other things. But one of those other things, it's not just self-actualization, it's also anxiety, right? It's also worry. And so, yeah, we've evolved into a place where we can, use our intellectual resources for something that's frankly it's not too productive. It's great if it makes us get a checkup, get our teeth cleaned, and, eat good food, eat food that's healthy for us, but it's not so good in some other ways. And yeah, I think that we haven't evolved to figure out how to deal with all of the technology, and we're not going to. I mean, technology is that we are never going to catch up. So, we had all these slow growth time, thousands of years of slow sort of change, and yeah, we're not really going to be able to do that. But I don't think your dog, Jen, has anxiety. Like, your dog is not worried, about the potential like wolf in the woods or whatever. And so, we could take a page out of, sort of the old, out of the historical, out of the caveman kind of existence, and sort of remember that we've never lived in a safer world. And
again, I don't think our brains have evolved to capture that. So, I mean, I think talking about anxiety and fear, I think we have translated anxiety into fear. So when someone says something negative on Twitter, our brain still reads it like, the saber-toothed tiger is coming after you, and we react in the same way. And that's where, I mean, there's things that we can do to kind of slow jam that reaction, and we're learning about them now. But like you said, I don't think we'll ever be able to catch up. It'll always be a step ahead of us. I mean, it's always going to be a constant work for us, and something that I think we need to. Sadly, what I fear is that it's not being acknowledged by a lot of people, because they are just like being born into it, right? Being born into the phone. I mean, for us, we're still catching up to to Gen Z and whatnot. But my son's generation. I mean, I don't know where you're going from here. I mean, maybe well, I guess we do know where we're going from here. It is automated boyfriends and girlfriends, but we haven't given up.
I did not really think about. Of course, I knew about the robots for like elderly people and stuff that they were trying out years ago. I mean, that's been going on for years. The pet seals and stuff that they did. They're so cute with their big eyes and everything. Yeah, so we, like if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? And our amygdala is what kept us alive, for all this time. And it has the ability to essentially co-opt all of our thinking. And so, it's, and it doesn't just sit there passively. It actually like, it's kind of like zing, wait, is there a danger? Wait, I don't know. Was there, so yeah, so it doesn't have anything to do. It doesn't have as much to do now because there aren't saber-toothed tigers. And so it's finding things, to worry about, I guess. Unfortunately,
it's translating anxiety, I think, into fear, even though it truly wouldn't be defined as fear, by.
It's not an actual saber-toothed tiger, right? It's just a phone.
Not literally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you both for having me on. This is really an honor. And I hope we can continue to do more work like this together. This is a prime opportunity and a prime time for us to really step into this space and make a difference and make an impact that lasts for decades, if not centuries.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad. It's been such an honor for us, for you to be part of ILV and helping us kind of shepherd these thoughts into hopefully the mainstream. And for our audience, also stay tuned for more of Nafees in December. He will be running our December Liberal Values Lab and will be a panelist on our December Liberalism and Practice panel discussion. More on that coming out. If you want to follow us on ilvalues.org and get on our newsletter, we'll have more about that out soon. Nafees, it is such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.